The moment the call came through, I was standing at the edge of the Aegean Sea, the kind of blue that almost makes you forget you work 80-hour weeks. My first real vacation in years, 3 days into what was supposed to be 10. I remember the warmth of the breeze, the faint taste of salt, and then the voice that shattered it all. Board meeting moved up. You're needed back immediately. Orders from the top. The top. That meant Adrian Whitmore, the CEO's son. Fresh out of business school, running around like a corporate prince, trying to prove he was more than a last name. He'd been given a project to lead, one I had spent months building. And apparently, his first power move was cutting my leave short. I tried to reason, told him I could dial in. Everything was ready. Every report, every forecast. But he wouldn't listen. Either you're here in person, he said, voice dripping with smug authority, or don't bother coming back at all. That was the moment something inside me snapped. Not loudly. Not angrily, just a quiet click, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. I booked the next flight, packed my half-unpacked suitcase, and left the sunlight behind. But as I sat by the plane window, watching the coast disappear beneath the clouds, I wasn't angry anymore. I was calculating. Adrian didn't know who he was dealing with. He saw me as the mid-level financial director who played by the rules. The woman who built the numbers while men like him took the credit. What he didn't realize was that I wrote those rules, and I knew exactly where the cracks were buried in every one of his shiny new deals. By the time my plane touched down, I already knew this vacation wouldn't be remembered for the days I lost, but for the empire that was about to crumble. When I walked into the office, the air was sharp with tension. Everyone moved faster than usual, whispering around the edges of the hallways. Adrian was waiting in the boardroom, perfectly groomed, pretending to look busy. His smirk widened when he saw me, a small, deliberate display of power. "Glad you could make it," he said, gesturing toward an empty seat like I worked for him. "We're presenting the revised acquisition strategy today. I've made some adjustments while you were away." Adjustments. That word hit like a loaded gun. As the presentation began, I realized what he'd done. He'd stripped my name from the documents, rewritten key financial clauses, and claimed my models as his own. The same models that balanced a multi-million-dollar merger. I watched in silence, my heartbeat steady, my mind dissecting every falsified number he was proudly showing the board. His arrogance was almost cinematic, but what he didn't know was that one of those clauses he had adjusted carried a silent trigger, a contractual failsafe that only I knew existed. He had just set it off, without even realizing, and as he spoke about his innovative strategy, I smiled. Not because I forgave him, but because I could already see the cracks forming beneath his empire of lies. He thought he'd ruined my vacation. He had no idea he'd just started his downfall. The next morning, the office felt different, colder. Or maybe it was just me. The version of myself that had returned wasn't the same one that left for the coast. I'd come back not as the diligent finance director they could push around, but as someone who finally understood how power worked in this building. Adrian strutted through the halls like a king. The staff laughed a little too hard at his jokes. The intern stood straighter when he passed, and the senior managers kept glancing at him as if he were the future. I knew better. He wasn't the future. He was a storm waiting to collapse under its own ego. My desk was spotless when I sat down. Too spotless. Someone had cleared away my files, my personal notes, even the small seashell I'd brought from my last trip years ago. That subtle erasure said everything. In this office, memories could be deleted as easily as names on a report. I opened my laptop, checked the internal servers, and saw what I expected. Adrian's name everywhere. His project, his strategy, my data, my equations, all rewritten, all slightly wrong. But I didn't fix them. Not yet. Instead, I began watching, listening, collecting. Adrian wasn't subtle. He bragged about late-night calls with investors he barely understood, threw jargon around in meetings, and pushed decisions that were designed to impress rather than sustain. His plan looked strong from the surface, but I could already see the fracture lines. The company was preparing for a massive acquisition. a $400 million deal that would define its next decade. I had spent months building the risk models, drafting the fiscal structure, and embedding clauses that protected the firm against speculative collapse. Adrian had rewritten those clauses, replacing safeguards with flexibility. It sounded impressive to the board, but it was financial dynamite. That was when I decided to stop being the fixer. I'd spent years patching, holes left by executives too, arrogant to understand the systems that kept them afloat. Not this time. If Adrian wanted credit, he'd get all of it. Every line, every clause, every reckless signature. That night, as the office emptied, I stayed behind under the hum of fluorescent lights. I opened the document trail. Every revision was logged, every approval time-stamped. I backed it all up, twice. Then I wrote a quiet memo to legal, a standard review request buried in jargon, referencing structural inconsistencies in the updated financial Clause 7C. Clause 7C. That was the one. The silent trigger I'd mentioned. A clause that looked harmless but, under the wrong conditions, could void the merger's compliance and freeze the transaction until further audit. In short, if Adrian's version went through, it would collapse under its own weight, and the board would trace it right back to him. I didn't plant it for revenge. I'd written it years ago, a safeguard against manipulation. But now, it was the perfect instrument. As I packed up to leave, I caught my reflection in the glass, calm, composed, unreadable. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel powerless, because power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits, silent, patient, disguised as obedience. And Adrian had just given me the perfect reason to use it. Over the next 2 weeks, Adrian's confidence grew into something almost theatrical. He strutted through the corridors like the company itself revolved around him. He hosted meetings that used to be mine, spoke in half-baked metaphors about vision and synergy, and soaked in every drop of attention he got. It was painful to watch. Not because he was succeeding, but because no one else could see the strings holding his performance together. The acquisition deal had reached its final stage, board approval. I watched him from across the room as he clicked through slides that used to be my work, presenting numbers he didn't even understand. He talked about optimized leverage ratios and debt neutrality, like buzzwords were bullets that could win him wars. The executives nodded, the investors smiled, and I sat quietly at the back, invisible in plain sight. But then it began. The unraveling. A junior analyst from compliance, a bright girl named Priya, sent me a discreet message one evening. "Ma'am, just to confirm, did you approve the change in Clause 7C? The new language doesn't match the audit framework." I almost smiled. She'd noticed it. That was the first thread. I told her to escalate it through proper channels, knowing exactly where it would end up. Within 48 hours, legal had opened an internal review. Suddenly, whispers filled the air. People started asking quiet questions. Adrian noticed. He called me into his office, the same one that used to belong to someone who'd actually earned it. "Listen," he said, pretending to be calm. "There's some confusion with legal about Clause 7 something. Just handle it. You wrote that stuff, right?" I looked at him. Really looked at him. The tailored suit, the expensive watch, the practiced smirk that came too easily. He was so used to the world cleaning up after him. "You mean the clause you personally revised?" I said softly. "The one you presented to the board?" For a second, his smile faltered. "Well, yeah, but it's your department. Fix it." I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice level. "It's your signature on the submission. Only you can authorize changes now." His jaw tightened. That was the moment he realized he was trapped in his own ego. Over the next few days, panic began to ripple through the higher floors. The acquisition partner was requesting clarifications. Investors were demanding reassurance. Clause 7C had triggered an automatic compliance hold. The $400 million deal was frozen. Emails flew, meetings multiplied, and through it all, Adrian tried to maintain control, blaming clerical errors and miscommunications. But every trail led back to him. His login, his timestamp, his digital signature. He started losing his composure. He barked at assistants, slammed phones on desks, and cornered people in hallways. He even confronted me again, voice lower this time. more desperate than commanding. "You knew this would happen," he said, narrowing his eyes. "Didn't you?" I met his stare. I knew this company needed safeguards. You removed them. For the first time, he didn't have a comeback. That night, the board convened an emergency meeting. Adrian wasn't invited at first, but he stormed in anyway, claiming authority he didn't have. What followed was chaos. Executives questioning him, legal advisors dissecting every revision, the CEO trying to contain the embarrassment. I stayed silent until someone finally turned to me and asked, "Can you explain in simple terms what this means for the merger?" I did, calmly, factually, without emotion. I explained how Clause 7C's modification violated cross-border compliance, rendering the transaction invalid until restructured. I didn't point fingers. I didn't need to. The facts did that for me. Adrian's father, the CEO, looked at him with a mix of shock and quiet fury. "Did you make these changes?" he asked. Adrian stammered. He tried to shift the blame, but there was nowhere left to shift it to. Every digital breadcrumb led back to him. When the meeting ended, the deal was suspended indefinitely. The company's stock dipped slightly, then stabilized, and as I walked out, I caught Adrian's reflection in the glass wall, pale, shaken, still trying to understand how everything had collapsed so quickly. He thought this was the worst of it, but it wasn't. Because this wasn't the end of the conflict. It was just the beginning of his downfall. The morning after the board meeting, the office felt like a crime scene, quiet, tense, and echoing with conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Adrian had gone from everyone's golden boy to a walking liability overnight, and while part of me wanted to feel satisfied, I didn't. Not yet, because I knew this story was far from over. When power is threatened, it doesn't vanish, it claws back. By noon, I was summoned to the CEO's office. Mr. Whitmore, Adrian's father, was sitting behind his massive oak desk, his expression carefully neutral. Adrian sat across from him, his jaw clenched, his eyes avoiding mine. The silence between them was the kind that carried years of expectation and disappointment. "Ms. Hayes," the CEO began, his tone polished but cold. "It seems there's been some confusion around your department's oversight. This clause situation has caused significant delays and embarrassment." I recognized the tactic instantly, redirecting the narrative, turning the victim into the culprit. "With all due respect," I replied evenly, "the revisions were made after my approval was bypassed." "All documentation confirms that," he leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes, but as director, oversight still falls under your purview. Perhaps you should have been more vigilant." And there it was, the quiet betrayal. Adrian said nothing, though I could feel his relief radiating beside me. His father was throwing me under the bus to protect the family name, to contain the scandal. I was no longer a witness. I was the scapegoat. "Sir," I said carefully, "if this is about accountability, then we should all be transparent about the sequence of approvals." He sighed. "Let's not escalate this, Ms. Hayes. We're all on the same team." That line, "we're all on the same team," was corporate code for accept your silence and move on. I nodded slowly, suppressing the heat in my chest. Understood. When I left the office, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. This wasn't just Adrian's arrogance anymore. It was institutional rot. The kind that protected power no matter how recklessly it behaved. Within a day, the HR director called me in for a routine review. My project access was limited, pending compliance. Verification. My inbox was flagged for data audits. Subtle. Retaliation masked as procedure, Adrian. Walked past my desk later that week, pretending not to notice me. But his smirk was back. Smaller, restrained, but there. He thought his father had saved him. That the mess had been neatly swept beneath my name. He had no idea that the real fallout hadn't even started. Because the moment I realized they were willing to sacrifice me to protect him, everything changed. I stopped thinking defensively and started thinking strategically. I began gathering evidence quietly. Every email, every revision, every private message that showed how the clause was altered without authorization. I had years of digital footprints stored in the compliance archives, and beyond that, I knew something no one else did. Adrian had used a dummy shell account to access restricted data for the deal. It was a shortcut, meant to bypass legal wait times, but it left a trail. A financial ghost that connected him directly to the claw's manipulation. That was the key. I reached out discreetly to one of my oldest contacts, a forensic auditor named Lillian, who'd left the firm 2 years ago after exposing a minor embezzlement case that the board buried. She owed me a favor. "Lillian," I said over a secure call, "I need a quiet audit." Off the record. Her pause was long. "How quiet?" "Buried quiet," I said. "No traces until it's time," she agreed. Within 3 days, she sent me an encrypted file. Inside it were system logs, proof of unauthorized access, and a record of Adrian's private device syncing with restricted folders during my vacation. That was all I needed. But I didn't rush. I waited. Watched. Let the office believe I'd been subdued, compliant, harmless. I even smiled at Adrian in passing, complimented his latest restructuring memo, pretended I'd accepted defeat. Because revenge isn't about reaction. It's about timing. One wrong move and it looks emotional. One right move and it looks like justice. And when the time came, I wouldn't just expose Adrian. I'd expose the system that protected him. They thought they'd buried me. But they'd just handed me the shovel. I had thought about revenge 1,000 different ways. Dramatic confrontations, leaked memos, a viral email that would humiliate him overnight. But those were fantasies for people who didn't understand how institutions bled. Real power moves are surgical, quiet, unmistakable. They leave the target alive enough to watch everything collapse. My plan had 3 parts: evidence, exposure, and structural correction. Evidence to make the story undeniable. Exposure to force the board's hand. Structural correction so that when the truth landed, the company could survive without the rot that protected him. I didn't want chaos for chaos's sake. I wanted order restored, and a lesson written where everyone could read it. First, evidence. Lillian's audit gave me the smoking gun, but I needed corroboration from inside systems no one thought to check, so I compiled a dossier. System logs, device sync timestamps, revision histories, and a trail of small transactions that traced back to that dummy shell account Adrian had used. I cross-referenced investor correspondence and the third-party legal notices that had been misfiled. Every piece bolstered the other like bricks in a wall. Second, exposure. I didn't want to whisper in the hallways. I wanted a moment that would force the board to act before cover stories could be assembled. But I also didn't want to be the person who hurled accusations in anger. I wanted the company itself, the governance structure, to demand accountability. So I prepared 2 parallel routes, one internal and one external. Internally, I drafted a compliance brief so sterile and by the book that it would be impossible to dismiss. No finger-pointing rhetoric, just facts, dates, system records, and the exact breach of protocol. I timed the brief to be submitted to the Audit and Risk Committee during their next scheduled oversight window. That committee couldn't ignore a formal submission. It was their duty to convene a review. Externally, I briefed a single trusted journalist who'd covered corporate malfeasance before. Not to sensationalize the story, but to ensure that if the company attempted to sweep things under the rug, public accountability would become a viable lever. I did this only as insurance. My primary objective was internal correction, not headlines. But when institutions protect family names over fiduciary duty, sometimes light becomes necessary. Third, structural correction. Clause 7C had been the trigger, a failsafe I'd written to prevent reckless, ego-driven restructuring. But the way it manifested now showed a deeper problem. The company's governance allowed senior leadership to bypass oversight if they clung to familiar faces. So I prepared a remedial package, tightened approval workflows, mandatory cross-check signatures for sensitive clauses, and an external compliance monitor for any transaction over a threshold. These were technical fixes, but they also reframed the narrative. This wasn't personal revenge. It was professional remediation. I set the sequence into motion with delicate timing. On a Tuesday morning, I submitted the dry, impartial compliance brief to the Audit and Risk Committee and copied legal per protocol. No flourish, no drama, just the documents, a clear request for audit, and a line noting potential unauthorized access tied to a corporate device ID. At lunch, I left my phone on silent and went to the small rooftop garden I'd only discovered last winter. I needed a place that felt outside the office gravity, the only place where I could breathe without the echo of judgment. My hands trembled more than I expected. This was the stage where careers could end, reputations could fracture, and families could rally like fortresses. I wasn't naive about the fallout. I only believed it had to be done. By 3, the first confirmation pinged. The committee acknowledged receipt and scheduled an extraordinary review. They couldn't ignore protocol. Their charter demanded it. The board secretary messaged, terse and formal, "Please be prepared to present your findings." Not a reprimand. Not a threat. Just the machinery of governance starting to turn. That evening, I delivered the external contingency. The journalist received a succinct summary, not a leak, but a conditional release. If the board failed to act within a defined time frame, the dossier would go public. I phrased it as a civic duty. The reporter understood. She asked one question. "Are you prepared for the fallout?" I answered simply, "I am prepared for the truth." The plan had another quieter layer: protection. I archived copies of everything in off-site encrypted storage, sent a sealed copy to Lillian, and forwarded a redacted, time-stamped file to a regulatory counsel I trusted. If anything went missing, these records would reappear exactly where they needed to, in the hands of people who cared about law more than legacy. The final element was psychological. I needed Adrian to believe he was still in control, to keep making the same mistakes while the legal machinery closed in. So I played the part of the subdued director: polite emails, cooperative meetings, an outward calm that suggested resignation. He took the bait. He relaxed. He began to resume his reckless swagger, convinced the storm had passed, and then I waited, not with impatience. With patience. Not with threats, with proof. Because when institutions are held to their own rules, they have no choice but to respond. The system would do the heavy lifting, if I only supplied the weight of truth. When the Audit and Risk Committee convened, the dossier was placed on the table. I watched from the doorway as the room read, absorbed, and finally, as protocol demanded, acted. Protocol doesn't have favorites. It has procedures, and procedures, when applied honestly, are a kind of justice. I left the rooftop that night feeling light and terrible at the same time. Light because the plan had moved beyond me. Terrible because I knew what accountability would require. It would cost people more than proud words, but it would also cleanse what arrogance had polluted. Revenge, in the end, wasn't about spectacle. It was about restoring order and making sure the next person who tried to play prince with other people's livelihoods would think twice. The Audit and Risk Committee met on a gray Friday morning, the kind of day where the city looked half asleep and even the glass towers seemed to hold their breath. I walked through the revolving doors of Whitmore Holdings with a calmness I didn't quite believe in. My evidence was already in their hands. The machine was turning. All I had to do was let it run. But Adrian didn't know that yet. He was waiting in the boardroom when I arrived, pacing, muttering under his breath, a man too used to winning to know how to lose. The CEO sat at the head of the long marble table, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. Around him, the committee members shuffled through their packets of documents. I could see my compliance brief, crisp, neatly tabbed, impossible to ignore. When the chairwoman of the committee began to speak, the room stilled. Her tone was clinical, detached, almost surgical. "After reviewing the submitted materials," she said, "we've confirmed unauthorized access to secured data systems during a restricted window. Access originated from an executive-level device registered under Adrian Whitmore's ID." The silence that followed could have cracked glass. Adrian froze. "That's impossible," he said quickly, his voice cracking. "I didn't. Someone's framing me." But the chairwoman didn't flinch. "The data shows multiple logins, document edits, direct transmission of restricted files from your device to an unregistered shell account. Would you like to explain how this occurred?" Adrian's eyes darted to me. There was confusion there first, then realization, and then anger. He finally understood that I had been 2 steps ahead the entire time. "You set me up," he hissed under his breath. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The truth didn't require my defense. The CEO leaned forward slowly. "Son," he said, voice low, "did you access those systems?" Adrian's lips parted, but no words came out. The confidence he carried for months evaporated in seconds. He was no longer the heir apparent, just another executive under review. The committee continued dissecting the evidence, layer by layer. The financial inconsistencies, the bypassed approvals, the manipulated clauses. Everything aligned perfectly. It wasn't just about Clause 7C anymore. It was about systemic breach, negligence, and corporate liability. By the time the meeting adjourned, the verdict was clear: temporary suspension pending a full investigation. Adrian's access revoked, legal compliance engaged. He stormed out of the room before anyone could stop him. I stayed seated, still and composed, while everyone else whispered. The CEO stood last, eyes meeting mine for the first time since that quiet betrayal weeks earlier. There was something raw behind his stare. Not apology, not anger, just realization. "Did you know this would happen?" he asked quietly. I looked him in the eye. I knew the system would correct itself, if given the chance. That night, Adrian's downfall became the firm's biggest secret. Officially, it was termed an internal compliance review. Unofficially, everyone knew what it meant. The staff whispered in elevators, investors called for explanations, and by Monday a crisis management team had been hired. But the dominoes didn't stop there. The external journalist I'd briefed sent me a discreet message. Board's internal report leaked. Not from me, stories developing. That was when I realized the narrative had escaped even my control, and maybe that was for the best. By Wednesday morning, the news broke. Whitmore Holdings under investigation for compliance breach, executive suspended. No names at first, but the hints were clear enough for anyone paying attention. By evening, Adrian's name was trending on finance blogs. The fallout was swift. Investors demanded accountability. Regulators launched inquiries. The CEO was forced to hold a press conference, vowing complete transparency. His voice trembled slightly when he said it. I watched it all from my apartment window. City lights flickering against the glass, the faint hum of traffic below. There was no satisfaction, not really, just a strange heavy calm, the kind that comes when justice finally balances the scales, even if it costs more than you imagined. Late that night, an email arrived in my inbox. From the CEO. "Ms. Hayes, effective immediately, the board has reinstated your authority over all pending financial reviews. I can't change what happened, but I can acknowledge who prevented something far worse. The company owes you more than it admits publicly. Thank you, R. Whitmore." I read it twice, then closed my laptop. In the reflection of the dark screen, I saw myself, not victorious, not vengeful, but awake. For years I'd been told that power was about control, but I'd learned something different. Real power is quiet. It's the ability to wait, to prepare, and to let truth speak when lies collapse. Adrian had destroyed himself with the very arrogance he thought made him untouchable. And I hadn't lifted a hand, only a document. But even as I watched the chaos settle, a small voice whispered inside me. This wasn't over. Not yet. Because men like him don't stay buried for long, and the system, even when it cleanses, always leaves traces of what it protected. When the dust settled, the truth was undeniable. The empire they'd built on deceit was crumbling. The CFO was stripped of her title within 48 hours. The board issued a formal apology, but I didn't attend the meeting to hear it. I was done giving them my silence. Instead, I watched the broadcast replay in my apartment, calm, centered, almost detached. Watching her stumble through her statement, her voice trembling under the weight of her own downfall, I realized something profound. Revenge isn't about fury. It's about restoration. About balance. HR tried to reach out. The CEO sent an offer to reinstate me with a promotion, a gesture drenched in guilt and fear. I turned it down, because what I wanted wasn't a seat at their table anymore. I wanted to build my own. Within weeks, I founded an independent consultancy, one designed to protect mid-level professionals from corporate exploitation. Word spread fast. Clients who had once ignored my warnings now came seeking my insight. The irony wasn't lost on me. They dismissed me when I spoke truth quietly, but now they paid to hear it loudly. One evening, as I left my new office, smaller but mine, I caught my reflection in the glass. I wasn't the same woman who once trembled before power. I was the woman who rewrote the rules, the one who proved that control isn't taken, it's reclaimed. And as city lights flickered in the distance, I smiled faintly. Some wars don't end in explosions or applause. Some end in silence, the kind that comes when justice finally exhales. The chapter of corporate chaos was over, but the legacy of what I'd done was just beginning. Power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. It shows who will protect it and who will weaponize it. I learned that silence isn't grace when it protects injustice. It's complicity. The CFO lost her title, but I gained something she never had: integrity, the kind that can't be bought or buried under contracts. And though my revenge wasn't loud, it echoed through every corridor that once tried to contain me. I didn't destroy her, I dismantled her illusion, and sometimes that's the most poetic justice of all. This is Revenge Untold, where the quiet rise and the powerful fall. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice served in silence.